Welcome back to Christian Tradition. Last week we talked about the Church of the New Exodus. This week we're going to be talking about the Pope, the Bishops, and the Magisterium. To understand the Church of the New Exodus, we have to look at the practical mechanics of how a message survives history. In any forensic audit of a large-scale movement, the first thing you look for is the chain of custody. If a king issues a decree, but there are no authorised officers to interpret or enforce it, the decree eventually becomes a dead letter, subject to the whims of whoever reads it next. Jesus did not merely leave us a set of ideas, he established an office. He knew that for the new Exodus to reach its destination, the truth had to be protected from organic drift. This is why the church isn't a book club. It's a teaching body. The authority we see in the papacy and the bishops isn't about human power, it's about data integrity. It is the king's fail-safe to ensure the message given at Pentecost remains uncorrupted 2,000 years later. In this session, we aren't just looking for who is in charge, we're explaining the succession protocol that keeps the march on course. We are moving from the who to the how. How does the king keep his church from getting lost? If we are going to understand how this march stays on course, we have to look at the chain of command. In any ancient kingdom, a king never ruled alone. He always had a second in command, an officer known in Hebrew as the Al-Habayet, or the one over the house. Think back to Joseph in Egypt. Pharaoh tells him, "You shall be over my house. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." Joseph had the king's authority, wore the king's ring, and issued the king's orders. We see this office again in the house of David. King Solomon had an officer over his house, and so did King Hezekiah. This wasn't just a fancy title, it was a functional necessity. The king provided the sovereignty, but the prime minister provided the day-to-day management. Without that office, the kingdom would fall into administrative chaos. Now keep that prime minister blueprint in mind when we look at Matthew 16. Jesus asks the apostles who they think he is, and Simon Bar-Jonah is the one who gets it right. But look at what Jesus does next. He doesn't just give Simon a gold watch for a job well done, he changes his name. In the entire Bible, God only renames someone on very rare high-stakes occasions, and the meaning is always life-changing. And here are the three before. Abram, which means exalted father, becomes Abraham, father of a multitude. Sarai, my princess, becomes Sarah, princess of nations. Jacob, the heel catcher or supplanter, becomes Israel, the one who strives with God. Every single time, a name change signifies a new nature and a massive new mission. When Jesus looks at Simon and says, "You are Peter," he is announcing that Simon has a new nature. He is the Kepha, in Aramaic, the rock, the foundational patriarch of the new Exodus. Now, we often say God is a rock, and that's true. But in Isaiah 51, the prophet tells the people to look to the rock from which you were hewn. And he's talking about Abraham. By calling Peter the rock, Jesus is identifying him as a new structural foundation. Then comes the specific job description. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This isn't a new metaphor Jesus just made up. He's quoting Isaiah 22. In that passage, the Lord of hosts takes the keys of the house of David and places it on the shoulder of a new prime minister named Eliakim. The key meant that whenever Eliakim opened a door, nobody could shut it. He held the king's power of the king's house in his hands. By giving Peter the keys, Jesus is officially installing him as a prime minister of the new covenant. Jesus then tells Peter he has the power to bind and loose. To a first century Jew, those weren't religious buzzwords. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, binding and loosing was a specific legal term. It meant the power to render a formal binding verdict on the law. To bind was to forbid, to loose was to permit. It also meant the authority to excommunicate someone from the community or readmit them. In other words, Jesus gave Peter the supreme judicial authority to interpret this message, the message of the kingdom. He wasn't giving Peter a magic wand, he was giving him the king's gavel. We see the system protection for this office in Luke 22. Jesus says something that often gets lost in the English translation. He warns, Satan has demanded to sift you all like wheat. He uses the plural you. He's talking to all the apostles. But then the grammar shifts. Peter says, but I have prayed for you, and here he switches to the singular. He is talking specifically to Peter. The strategy is clear. Satan attacks the whole group, but Jesus protects the group by providing a fail-safe in the leader. He prays for Peter's faith to remain firm so that Peter can strengthen his brothers. Peter is the anchor that prevents the rest of the leadership from drifting. Finally, in John 21, the risen King gives Peter a threefold instruction. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. In the Hebrew tradition, repeating something 3 times wasn't just for emphasis. It was a way of showing totality and legal certainty. It was the ultimate binding of a contract. Just as Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus commissions him 3 times, covering the entire flock from the smallest lamb to the grown sheep. In the ancient world, to feed or tend the people was a standard language of governing them. The audit is complete. Peter is the king's authorised representative. He is the visible rock, holding the keys and managing the march until the king returns. If Peter is the king's prime minister, then the apostles are the field officers of the new Exodus. But here's a forensic question. What happens when an officer falls? We see the protocol in action almost immediately in Acts 1:15-26. After the death of Judas, Peter stands up and declares, using the authority we looked at in the last scene, that another must take his office. The Greek word used there is episkope, which is where we get our word bishop. This is our first major clue. The man was gone, but the office remained. It was a structural vacancy that had to be filled to keep the march moving. The mission didn't die with the individual. It was designed to be transferred. This wasn't a new invention. Jesus was reaching back to the deep architecture of the first Exodus. In Numbers 27:18-23, when Moses was preparing to step aside, God didn't tell the people to vote for a new leader. He told Moses to take Joshua and lay your hands upon him, to invest him with authority. That physical act, the semicar, was the visible transfer of the king's commission. We see it again in Numbers 11:16-17, where God takes the spirit that was on Moses and shares it with a council of 70 elders. They weren't independent agents, they were a college of leaders, all tuned to the same signal, ensuring the law was applied consistently across the entire camp. This is the Old Testament blueprint for what we now call the College of Bishops. Jesus takes this council structure and hardwires it into the New Covenant in Matthew 18:15-20. He tells us that if a dispute can't be settled privately, you have to take it to the church. Notice he doesn't say take it to a private interpretation or a vague feeling. He points to a visible authoritative body you can go to that everyone will accept has authority. And then he gives the entire group of apostles the power to bind and loose. While Peter holds the keys for the whole kingdom, the apostles as a body act as the king's supreme court. Their verdicts on the march aren't just opinions, they are legally binding decisions backed by the king himself. And then we have the 4-generation relay. As the new Exodus expanded across the Roman Empire, the apostles needed to appoint overseers to maintain the chain of custody. This is exactly what we see in Paul's instructions to his delegates Timothy and Titus. In Titus 1:5, Paul says he left Titus in Crete specifically to set in order what remains and to appoint elders in every city. Titus wasn't just a preacher. He had jurisdictional authority over an entire island. In 1 Timothy 1:3, Paul charges Timothy to command certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. This is command and control in its purest form. But look at the succession formula. In 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul tells Timothy, "What you have heard from me entrust to faithful people who will be able to teach others." That's a 4-generational relay race of authorized teaching in a single verse. And it was transmitted through the laying on of hands, which is in 1 Timothy 4:14 and 2 Timothy 1:6. It was a physical, visible baton pass that ensured the message couldn't be corrupted by outside noise. According to the Catechism, this succession ensures that every bishop carries the same threefold mandate. They are here to teach the original message, sanctify the marchers with new manner of the sacraments, and govern the logistics of the camp. The bishops of succession, because they hold the same office. The episcopae, first established in the desert and perfected by Christ. The chain of custody is verified. The march continues under authorized command. We have audited the officers, but now we have to look at the operating manual. In any forensic investigation, a document is only effective as its interpretation. Think of it this way. A nation can have a perfect constitution, but if every citizen is authorized to be their own supreme court, you don't have a nation, you have a chaotic collection of 300 million different opinions. The law becomes a dead letter because there is no way to produce a unified verdict. The king of the new Exodus knew this. He didn't just leave us a book, he left us with a living voice to ensure the message remained a single, unified signal across the centuries. This wasn't a new idea. In the first Exodus, God provided a specific teaching office to resolve disputes. In Deuteronomy 17:8-12, the law is explicit. If a case is too difficult to judge locally, the people were commanded to go to a central authority, the Levitical priest and the judge in office at the time. Their decision was final. It was the supreme court of the desert march. God tells the people they must carry out the verdict exactly, because without a final arbiter, the community would fracture before they ever reached the Jordan. We see this office described in Malachi 2:7, when he says the lips of the priest should preserve knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth. The priest was the guardian of the signal. Even Jesus acknowledges structural reality in Matthew 23:2 when he spoke about the chair of Moses. He recognized there was an authorized office for teaching that existed even when the men holding it were flawed. Jesus didn't abolish this teaching office, he upgraded it. He tells the apostles in Luke 10:16, "Whoever listens to you listens to me." By doing this, he was hardwiring the living voice into the new Exodus. The apostles, and those they appointed, became the new Supreme Court for the march. Their job wasn't to invent new rules, but to issue the final binding interpretation of the king's commands. This is a failsafe of the mission. When we talk about the church being unable to on the core message, We aren't talking about a superpower given to a man. We are talking about the King's guarantee that the signal will not be lost. It is the assurance that the doctrine remains unified, preventing the message from becoming a dead letter in the hands of 1,000 different interpreters. A march without a head is a mob. A constitution without a court is a recipe for division. But a teaching church provides a certainty that every marcher is reading off the same map and following the same orders. The chain of command is verified. The Supreme Court is in session. The audit of the teaching office is complete. We know who is leading, we know who is authorised, and we know the message is secure. We have completed our audit of the teaching office. We've seen the King's Prime Minister holding the keys, the field officers maintaining the succession, and the Supreme Court providing the final verdict on the message. The evidence shows that the Church was never intended to be a loose collection of independent thinkers. It was designed from day one to be a unified command structure. Why? Because a mission this important, to rescue humanity, cannot afford a broken signal. The King didn't leave us to guess the route. He left us a verified structure to ensure we arrive at the right destination. When you stand in the church today, you aren't standing in a museum of ancient ideas. You are standing in the living flow of the original message. Every authorised teaching you hear, every sacrament you receive, and every direction the march takes is part of a 2,000-year chain of custody that has survived empires, persecutions, and the internal failures of men holding the office. The office is greater than the man. The mission is greater than the moment. And the forensic record is clear. Jesus built a church that can teach. He built a church that he promised to protect. The audit of the structure is complete, but how do we know the manual itself is reliable? Next week we move on to week 8, the Bible and tradition. We're going to investigate the chain of custody for the word itself. How did the oral preaching of the apostles become a written manual? And more importantly, who decided what made the cut into the New Testament? We'll look at the forensic evidence for how the church received, protected and transmitted the word to ensure the signal stayed pure for the rest of history. I'll see you then. Until then, stay on the map, keep the signal clear, and may God bless you and guide you. And like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment below.